All right, y'all, here we are for Historical Period 9, the very last period of the AP US History curriculum. This historical period starts where the previous one left off in 1980 with Ronald Reagan's election. Reagan becomes president in 1981, and in theory at least, it goes through the present, although as we'll talk about going forward, the level of detail that you need to know past the Reagan presidency is much more minor than in the rest of the test. As far as how this might be tested on the AP exam, just like historical periods 1 and 2, the testing of historical period 9 is restricted to certain types of questions. You will not get a DBQ that only deals with the stuff that we're going to talk about here. It will not be the focus of the DBQ. You will also not get most of the main SAQs, the SAQ1 or SAQ2. Where you will see some of this information that we're going to go over is definitely in the stimulus-based multiple choice. There will probably be at least one or maybe even possibly two questions that deal with some of this post-1980 content. It may also be an option on the LEQ. Remember, the LEQ gives you 3 options, so the third one might be sort of a more modern one dealing with some of this time period, and it might also be an option on the SAQ, right? You have the option between SAQ 3 and 4 generally deals with later stuff, might potentially include some of this. So we're sort of picking up and launching right into historical period 9. Ending historical period 8 in 1980 with Reagan's election makes a lot of sense in one way because it is a political turning point, right? It marks the rise of the neoconservative movement. But in another way, it kind of leaves us hanging on one of the major themes of historical period 8, which was the Cold War, right, which we talked about extensively in the last video. So we're going to sort of return to the Cold War here for a couple of slides and just talk a bit about how this ends, and in particular about the role that the Reagan administration plays in the ending of the Cold War. So this flowchart might look a little bit familiar if you watched the last video. This is sort of trying to summarize basically how the Cold War plays out over the series of 9 presidents who are president during the Cold War, and specifically how the Cold War fluctuates, to use the College Board's term, between direct conflict, which you can see kind of circled here in red, indirect conflict, which you can see circled here in blue, and then what's called détente, or sort of a period of more friendly relations or diplomacy between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that is what is circled here in yellow. The last version of this that you saw did not have Reagan and Bush, and so we're adding them kind of at the bottom to talk about the fact, and what you can kind of see from the colors here is that under Reagan, we're going to see another shift in sort of how are we doing containment policy during the Cold War. We've been in détente for about 10 years, right? Détente was introduced under Nixon, continued under Ford, and then reluctantly continued under Carter until it broke down when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And so when Reagan comes into office, he is going to sort of return us to a little bit more like the old school style of Cold War, which with much more sort of direct verbal confrontation and kind of indirect covert fighting of the Cold War. Here's how the College Board sort of phrases that. They want you to know that Reagan asserted United States opposition to communism through speeches. Reagan very famously called the Soviet Union the evil empire, right, calling back to the movie series Star Wars trilogy. The original trilogy was out in theaters during the time of Reagan's presidency. Another big famous kind of like strong Reagan speech is the one that you see on the slide here, where he travels to Berlin, stands in front of the Berlin Wall and says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So again, very sort of like hardline rhetoric. Next bullet point down, the Reagan administration also steps up diplomatic efforts. We're going to see a series of summit meetings between Reagan and then the Soviet premier, who for most of Reagan's second term is a guy named Gorbachev. We're also going to see some limited military interventions. The United States will send troops abroad in small ways for the first time since the Vietnam War, right? We haven't done much of that since Vietnam didn't go well for us, but we're going to start to do that again under Reagan. In particular, the United States is going to start funding covertly essentially a resistance movement against the Soviets in the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan. So we're funding like a covert war in Afghanistan, and we're also under Reagan going to fund a buildup again of our nuclear arsenal. You might potentially be familiar with a program that was nicknamed Star Wars, where the Reagan administration was talking about using essentially like laser technology to try to build like a missile defense system, which we weren't really technologically capable of doing in the 1980s, but it really put a lot of economic pressure on the Soviet Union. So all of those things together kind of combined put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union, which is already in kind of a bad economic position. The Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan and occupation of that country for about 10 years are going to have the same impact on the Soviet Union that the United States invasion and occupation of Vietnam have on the United States, which is to say that it sort of drains the economy. It's very unpopular at home. It's this kind of long drawn out conflict that they can't get out of. And so the Soviet Union is in some trouble by the time that Reagan takes office, and Reagan's policies, kind of put extensive pressure on them. Reagan leaves office in 1989, having served his 2 terms. He's replaced by his vice president, our first President Bush, right? There's 2 President Bushes. This is the father, George Herbert Walker Bush, or H.W. Bush. And under H.W. Bush, the sort of already in progress kind of collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet economic system basically continues. Starting in about 1988, really escalating in 1989, 1990, and 1991, what we're going to see is a series of almost entirely bloodless revolutions happening first in countries that are sort of allied with the Soviet Union. They're sort of part of the Warsaw Pact, right? They're kind of satellite countries is a term that's used often. You can see a lot of the sort of European subset of those countries here in yellow. So we're going to see countries like Poland, where we have workers or just kind of ordinary citizens rising up, forming kind of counter political organizations. In Poland, it's a labor union that's usually called Solidarity in English, and then pushing for and eventually holding free elections to replace the kind of communist Soviet allied government with a non-communist, non-Soviet allied government, sometimes democratic or something, sometimes something else. So we see all of these revolutions happening, elections happening, governments being replaced in those, again, kind of satellite countries, and then it also starts to spread to the nations within the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union is a composite state made up of a bunch of different kind of countries that have united together, just like the United States is made up of states, right? The Soviet Union is made up of nations. It's a union of nations. And those nations, which you can see in green on here, are also going to start to have independence movements. They'll have elections. They'll vote to leave, essentially to secede from the Soviet Union. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania do that in 1990. And then most significantly, the country of Russia votes to secede from the Soviet Union and form an independent Russian government in 1991. They elect a guy named Boris Yeltsin. And when that happens, essentially there really is no more Soviet Union effectively. The premier of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, will sort of declare that the Soviet Union has been dissolved. I think it's December 25th, 1991, and the USSR is broken up. The Cold War is over, right? The United States has officially won. This also triggers the fall of a bunch of other governments around the world that had been supported by the Soviet Union. You can see kind of like a list down there at the bottom. So we're really seeing kind of like a global collapse of the like Soviet-style communism around the world. Very, very, very significant. The most famous example of this, by the way, is the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the fall of East Berlin, right? The sort of government of East Berlin, which happens in 1989. Germany reunites in 1990, so that's quite significant, definitely. Although Soviet-style communism is dead in 1991, keep in mind that that doesn't mean there's no more communism. China remains a center of essentially communism, right? Although their government is definitely shifting over the next few decades as well. The same year that the Berlin Wall comes down, 1989, the Chinese government brutally puts down similar style kind of like student-led protest in its government in an incident that's called the Tiananmen Square incident. So communism is mostly gone, but not entirely, and we still have like essentially China, right, as a center of communism in the post-Cold War world. With the ending of the Cold War in 1991, this is a very, very significant turning point for American foreign policy, right? We have locked our entire foreign policy since 1945 around containment. Our sole kind of criteria for what are we doing out in the world is like, is this country communist? If so, we don't like and we don't support. Is this country non-communist? If so, no matter what else is going on, like we support, right? We will promote. And now that that very clear kind of like essentially black-white binary of like communism, non-communism is sort of gone, the United States has a kind of a challenge or a new era in front of it in the 1990s where we have to kind of figure out like, well, what's like the guiding principle of our foreign policy? Like, what are we doing with our foreign policy? George H.W. Bush, who's president at the time, refers to this as like a new world order. And in the 1990s, you're going to see the United States kind of like debating and trying to figure out like, okay, like what is our role in the world? We're kind of like the only remaining superpower at this point since the other superpower, right, the Soviet Union, has been dissolved. What do we do with that? Do we promote democratic ideals around the world? Are we a stabilizing force? Do we stay out of things? Like what are we doing? So you don't necessarily need to know a ton about like the details of all of this, but it is a good idea to have an example of some of the types of things like a foreign policy interactions that the United States engages in. I think that the most significant at the top here is what's usually called the First Persian Gulf War. This is the United States' first war in the Middle East. It's fought in basically the same region where we are going to fight the Iraq War about 12, 13 years after this. So sometimes it's also called the First Iraq War, but Persian Gulf War most common. This is basically the first war the United States has fought since World War II that is not like about communism in some way, shape, or form. It's not a proxy war. And most significantly, what this involves is the United States forming a coalition, not just with NATO, who we're very familiar with, right, and have been allies with for a long time, France, Great Britain, right, Italy, those kind of familiar countries, but for the first time, allying with several other Middle Eastern countries that aren't Israel, that are Saudi Arabia being sort of the most significant or notable, but Egypt as well, in an effort to stop the country of Iraq under the leadership of Saddam Hussein from invading its neighboring country, the sort of small, very oil-rich country of Kuwait. So the Persian Gulf War is a short, kind of like glorious and successful war for the United States, at least on the surface, but it definitely marks, again, a shift of United States foreign policy into this sort of new post-Cold War era. And if you look on kind of like the right-hand side of the slide here, I think this is a pretty good summary of kind of like what types of things, what sort of debates are we having about our foreign policy in this time period. So this is a good thing to sort of pause and review. The 90s also see us essentially trying out our role as world police in various ways that often don't work. We go into Somalia to try to essentially stabilize the government there that's going through a kind of series of civil wars and famines. That does not work. There's sort of some very infamous loss of American life as several of our helicopters are shot down and American service members are killed. So that's quite unpopular at home. We sort of pull back from this idea that like we're just going to sort of go in and be the good guys in conflicts around the world. We also see the rise of terrorism focused on American targets around the world. Very early Al-Qaeda attacks pre 9/11 start to happen in 1998 with the bombings of U.S. embassies in cities like Dar es Salaam in Africa, and also attacks on the USS Cole, which was a United States naval ship that was stationed in the Middle East. So there's sort of kernels of how our foreign policy is going to develop, like coming up here in a little bit. So that's sort of like foreign policy post Cold War, pre 9/11. The other kind of next big thing that we need to pick up with where we sort of left off in 1980 is what is going on in United States politics. I think it's useful to know a couple of specific things about the Reagan administration, and then everything else we're going to talk about with politics, we're going to talk about more as sort of general trends coming up here. So first up for Reagan, the College Board does want you to know that when Reagan gets in, he is a neoconservative, as we talked about at the end of the last video, which is this sort of new kind of segment of the Republican Party that has sort of pulled the Republican Party more rightward, right, on the political spectrum. And one of the ways that that sort of plays out under Reagan and also under subsequent Republican presidents after him is that we're going to see the enactment of more neoconservative style economic policies. The Democrats, since the New Deal, have been very committed to sort of an economic theory of like government's role in the economy that's usually called Keynesian economics or sometimes pump priming economics, which basically said that when there is a recession, the government should sort of put money into the economy by kind of trying to give jobs to like working class people, provide stimulus, right, do deficit spending type stuff, so sort of like printing and spending money to try to float the economy upwards, right? That has been the basic Democratic Party's answer to what do we do if we're in a recession since 1933, right, since the New Deal. Here under Reagan, the Republican Party is going to propose sort of their answer, almost in many ways kind of like the opposite or an inverse of Keynesian or pump priming economics. The term for this style of economics associated with neoconservatives is supply side economics is the formal name, or trickle down economics is the nickname. It sort of starts out as a critique and then I think gets kind of embraced by a lot of people in the Republican Party. And what this form of economics says is, well, if there's a recession, what the government should do is not kind of like deficit spend money into the economy and try to put money in at like the working class. Instead, the government should sort of back off a little bit and instead just sort of provide kind of like tax cuts and relief for like job creators, right? For sort of the people at the top of society who own businesses and who are heavy investors. And if you can like put more money in their pockets, then they will like invest in their businesses, they'll hire more people, and that money will sort of flow down or trickle down right to the rest of society. So it's sort of also stimulus, but aimed more at, again, kind of like the sort of job creator and investor class. And what this has fueled is throughout kind of Reagan and onward, when we get Republicans in office, what we're going to see is this idea that the best way that the government can help the economy is to provide like tax cuts, especially tax cuts that target people who are again in the job creator class. So we see tax reductions under Reagan, we see tax reductions under George W. Bush. That's the second of the two Bushes, right? We have HW and then W, and we also see tax reductions during President Trump's first term as well. Another feature of kind of neoconservative economics that the College Board calls out specifically is deregulation, right? Ever since the progressive era, the United States has been building more and more and more regulations, right? We've been regulating businesses more. You can't put rats in your meat, and the banks have to follow certain rules, and like child labor laws exist, right? More and more and more regulations. And now what the argument of neoconservatives is that we've sort of gone too far, right? There's so many regulations that businesses can't really do business anymore, and we need to kind of cut some of that red tape and roll back regulations. And so we're going to see deregulation of some industries, including banking and savings and loan. Natural gas, or sort of like energy industries in general, are going to get deregulated, especially under Reagan and also under George W. Bush as well. The airline industry, to encourage the creation of new sort of competitive budget airlines, right? Those types of things. So that's kind of like economic policy stuff, right, from the neoconservative wave that will dominate the Republican Party from the 1980s through the 90s into the 2000s. Just a quick kind of like overview of the presidencies. You don't really need to know a ton about the policies of each of these specific kind of like post-Reagan presidents, but some sort of overview things that I do think are quite helpful. In the United States, we do tend to kind of shift between the Democratic and Republican parties, and if you sort of look at this here, we'll see that we're sort of swinging back and forth. Like we elect a Republican, we elect a Democrat, we elect a Republican, we elect a Democrat. But it's good to know that in the 1990s in particular, the Republicans and Democrats that we're electing are both pretty centrist. H.W. Bush is a pretty moderate Republican. Bill Clinton is quite a centrist Democrat as president, and so their policies are really quite similar. We'll see, I'm going to talk about a couple of Clintons in particular that sound pretty neoconservative. And then I would say since President Obama, we've seen that swing start to get a little bit wider, and we're sort of moving more away from like the center of the political spectrum in terms of the policies that we're seeing from various presidents. Other kind of political stuff, again, we're getting more into like the general themes that you need to know a little bit about. So from Reagan onward, the College Board would like you to know that conservatives like Reagan, Bush, etc., are arguing that liberal programs are kind of counterproductive to fighting poverty and stimulating economic growth. So they're basically arguing that like LBJ's sort of big government, great society style solutions, right, to the problems of society are not good solutions. And instead we should be kind of shrinking the size of the government, cutting programs, putting more in the hands of states and individuals and like private charities and things like that. But the College Board would further like you to know that although that has been the rhetoric of the Republican Party for a long time, they have had a hard time actually cutting some of the biggest sort of like tentpole like liberal programs from the New Deal and from the Great Society, because they have been popular with voters. And the biggest and best example of those are Social Security, which remains very much a thing today, and then also the healthcare programs, Medicare and Medicaid. So Social Security was introduced under the New Deal. Medicare and Medicaid come from the Great Society, and although they've been targets of, again, kind of like the sort of neoconservative anti-big government rhetoric, they have remained intact, again, largely because they benefit elderly people, and elderly people vote, right? That's a very strong voting constituency. Other kind of areas of political policy debate, again, in a more general way, I tried to color code this. I apologize if it makes it confusing. But some policy debates kind of Reagan onward that you need to know a little bit about. A big one that springs up are what are called free trade agreements. I've seen this in some released multiple choice questions, so this is a good thing to know a little bit about. A free trade agreement is a treaty, basically, signed between multiple countries where they agree to remove trade barriers so that goods that are made or produced in one country can be sold in another country without having to pay like tariffs, right, or to go through like certain customs requirements or things like that. So you're promoting free trade, right? The free trade agreements are promoting essentially more globalization, right? More easy access to goods. The United States sort of really enters the free trade world by signing NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994. NAFTA is negotiated under President George H.W. Bush, right, Republican, and then is signed under President Bill Clinton after he wins election in 1992. So it's a good example of what I was talking about, where there's some sort of bipartisan agreement in in the 1990s anyway, in the centrist realm, that these free trade agreements are good things. They've led to a lot of debate inside of the United States between people who are like pro-globalization and they're like, yes, this is the economic wave of the future. We get cheaper goods from this, right? We have more access to sort of global, trade around the world. Americans can take higher paying kind of like knowledge and service jobs here at home instead of doing our own manufacturing. And then we have this sort of counter argument that says, well, no, this is like bad for American workers. It's sort of taking American jobs. That's the very common argument because now, you can just make the, American cars can be made in Mexico by Mexican workers, who are getting paid much less. And American auto workers are sort of losing those jobs, right, is the argument here. So a big sort of feature of politics from Reagan onward are these sort of debates over globalization, basically, and the extent to which is it like good for the American economy? Is it good for or bad for the American worker? Another kind of flashpoint of this is the creation of what's called the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. You should think of the WTO as being an organization sort of similar to the United Nations. It's an NGO, a non-government organization that contains sort of representatives from countries all over the world. But the WTO has a very specific economic focus. It's supposed to try to organize and kind of adjudicate basically like trade disputes, manage all sorts of international trade agreements and things of that nature. And when the WTO is founded in 1995, there is a big sort of wave of street protests in Seattle, which was one of the headquarters of the WTO, which contained kind of an interesting cross section of like you have like auto workers and you have kind of environmentalists from the kind of new left who think that it's going to be bad for like environmental production and like pollution and things like that. So globalization is something that's sort of, I would say, realigning American politics, right, and sort of shifting where constituencies fall. In particular, it's going to have a big role in moving like blue collar, factory workers out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party increasingly as like the 90s and 2000s go on. So that's free trade agreements. Another sort of area of debate that we've already touched on is this idea about like how much, how big, how sort of strong should the government's like social safety net programs be, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right, welfare, food stamps, right, those types of programs. Those are social safety net programs. Reagan sort of like brings attention to this or sort of calls this out by introducing tropes, racist tropes in many ways, like the welfare queen, which is like a term that's sort of coined during his administration, to argue basically that essentially people are sort of abusing these programs and that they're bad for society because they are creating sort of like weakness or dependency in Americans. And we see that rhetoric picked up by both sort of the Republicans and the Democrats in the 1990s. Under Clinton, we see what's called the welfare reform bill, which essentially like restricts welfare and adds a bunch of requirements. Like if you're going to be on welfare, you have to kind of jump through a bunch of different hoops, etc. So we see sort of, again, debates about that. Another big addition to the sort of government social safety net debate is the debate over healthcare, which the Clinton administration tries to pass and then fails, and then we get the sort of successful, although very controversial, was usually called Obamacare, but the correct name is the Affordable Care Act that introduces Obamacare, right, to the United States. So those are good examples of, again, social safety net debates. Last one that the College Board calls out here specifically is calls to reform the U.S. financial system. This especially comes after the 2008 financial crisis, right around the time when you were born, if you're watching this video as it's produced here in 2005. So in 2008, there is a massive financial collapse that leads to a very long and extended recession or depression in the United States, and that leads to a lot of calls from Americans essentially to try to do more to regulate like the banks and address the causes of this collapse. So we see activist movements like Occupy Wall Street, where we have a bunch of activists like in the street, right, in tents trying to literally occupy Wall Street. We have some laws that are passed, the Dodd-Frank Act, which creates a bunch of regulations on banks and leads to the creation of an organization called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that's supposed to be like a watchdog agency to make sure that banks aren't like cheating consumers, right, or engaging in unfair practices. So that's a kind of what's going on with that particular key concept. Kind of last of these sort of like broad politic-y key concepts here, looks a little bit more at some social issues, so you can sort of see the language of the College Board there, and it specifically calls out immigration policy and then family structure, so just a little bit on these. We have increasingly had debates over immigration more like broadly, but very specifically the problem of undocumented immigration. Remember that modern immigration debates date back basically to the 1965 Immigration Act, which got rid of the quota system and replaced it with the system that we have today, which prioritizes family reunification, refugee settlement, and then skilled workers, but did not especially originally have a very kind of robust infrastructure for like temporary workers, migrant workers, people to do farm work, right? Those types of things. We have a big demand for that kind of immigration in the United States, but not really a very clear or extensive legal pathway for people to come in like in a legal way and do that work. So this is going to lead to a big surge in undocumented immigration starting in 1965 and escalating. Several attempts to try to tackle this. In 1986, under Reagan, we have the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which tries to basically just declare amnesty for all people who came in undocumented before 1982, and then kind of step up enforcement. It also fails to kind of meet the need or meet the sort of scale of need for for this particular type of immigration. And so after that, we're really going to see American immigration laws shift more towards punishment and deterrence. In 1996, under Clinton, we get IRA, which makes it much more difficult for people who are in the country undocumented to like become documented. That process becomes much more difficult and punitive. In 2012, under Obama, we see an attempt to address this through an executive order, creating DACA, which tries to deal with people who came in undocumented as children, right? Not sort of on their own cognizance as adults. So this is not an area that we have resolved, right, in any way, shape, or form, but it's definitely an ongoing area of debate. Another area that the College Board calls out is family structures. There's a number of different things that you could talk about here. I wanted to just highlight gay marriage because I think it's a particularly good example here. So the question of like legalizing marriage for same-sex couples really starts to be a thing that's kind of talked about a lot in the 1990s. It comes out of the problems of the AIDS crisis, where lots of people were denied access to their partners, right, as they were dying of AIDS. And so that's like you don't see people talking about like gay marriage as an issue in like the 1970s very much. Not nobody, but not very much. So starting in the late 1990s and 2000s, we see sort of states trying to weigh in on this, sort of a couple of states early on that try to create like civil partnerships or kind of parallel institutions. In 1996, the federal government makes a firm ruling. It's called DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, where they basically say that the federal government will not recognize any sort of same-sex marriages, no matter like if like your state decides that they will, the federal government will not. States are kind of wrestling this out. California like briefly allows same-sex marriages, and then voters pass a proposition called Prop 8 in 2008 that says no, same-sex marriage is outlawed in California, and then it's like challenged in the courts. So there's this sort of like ongoing state-by-state sort of battle that's happening across the United States that is finally resolved by the Supreme Court in 2015 with the Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges, which essentially says that state bans of same-sex marriage are unconstitutional. So this is sort of a good ongoing debate about, again, family structures, family norms in the 2000s through the early 2010s. Next kind of area key concepts for historical period 9 from the College Board has to do with changes in the economy and changes in technology. And those two things are very intertwined, right? What is largely changing in the economy mostly has to do with changes in technology. So a few things on that specifically. Number one, the College Board would like you to know that new developments in science and technology both enhanced the economy and transformed society in this time period. So for everything that I'm sort of talking about on this slide, you should think a little bit about, well, like what's the economic impact, and then also what's the like social impact. Some examples of technological innovations. Most of this stuff really starts back in like the 1960s and 70s, and then we're sort of like playing it out here in the historical period 9 time period. So what you can see that I have on here is not necessarily when the technology was invented, but when did actually like ordinary people sort of start to get access to it? When was it popularized? So we see the first like satellite communication, satellite TV, satellite radio, satellite phones, those types of things starting in the 1970s. I mentioned in the previous video that home computers really, and also cell phones, mobile phones really start to become a thing in the 1980s, and that the internet doesn't start to become a thing until really like the mid 1990s is when most Americans start to sort of get online and get email and email access, and when offices start to be able to use it as well. That's obviously a major kind of impact in terms of like office businesses, right, and globalization, and then also interpersonal connections, right? Social media, so things like Facebook, right, Instagram, etc. You don't really see those until the early 2000s. Facebook launches in 2004 and then sort of goes wide in like 2005, 2006 to sort of like, just anybody who wants to sign up. You guys, as I think I mentioned, are about as old as the smartphone, so that's about where that is. Um, Other kind of worth knowing what starts to happen here in terms of like the economic impact is that a lot of these technology companies become kind of like the new monopolies, right? If you go all the way back to when we talked about the Gilded Age, and we have these sort of new business structures with like robber barons and these pools and trusts and monopolies that are really dominating the economy. This sort of like historical period 9 version of that is these tech companies, right, which can become very dominant in American society and in the economy as well. So you have a couple down here, right? Microsoft, Apple, Amazon introduces in 1994. It's just a book selling website at first, and then it slowly sort of becomes the everything website that it's working on being today. Again, Facebook and sort of social media in general starts in 2004 as well. So there's some examples of like technology. Just be very careful here if you get an essay about technology, which we've seen several times from the college board, to just really like watch what are the beginning dates and what are the end dates, like how late can I go. If it's an essay about technology and it stops in 1980, you shouldn't really be talking about the internet except maybe in the conclusion. So just keep an eye on the dates there, because that's a common way that the college board loves to trick you. Other impacts, so this is the same thing, but just focusing on slightly different things. So we know that new developments in science and technology enhance the economy and transform society, yay, right? But also, at the same time, the other continuing trend from the last historical period is that manufacturing is decreasing. This is a trend that starts in the US in the 1970s and continues today, right? The peak of American manufacturing comes kind of in the early 1900s at the height of like the Gilded Age, right? The progressive era. And the United States is the biggest manufacturing power in the world. And as manufacturing has declined starting in the 1970s and service jobs and technological jobs, right, have been on the rise, these sort of things that have come with that for the American economy are, number one, a decline in the power of unions. And that's what you're seeing in the graph that is on the right of the slide here that I'm kind of circling. This is looking basically at the blue line is of all of the workers in the United States, of what percent are employed, and you can see that that's sort of at its height from the 1930s when unionism is legalized by the Wagner Act, all the way through about the 1970s when United States manufacturing starts to decline, and then that's been on a fall ever since. So that's the kind of a connection that you might commonly be asked to make by the College Board. Again, as manufacturing declines, the power of unions declines as well. The other thing over here on the left-hand side of the slide is what are called real wages stagnating. So real wages is not just like the number on your paycheck, it's how much can you actually buy with your wages. So it doesn't matter if you're making $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, like how much can that $1,000 or $2,000 actually buy you in terms of like, groceries, right, say for example. And the trend that we have seen really since the 1970s is that real wages for the middle class and working class have sort of stagnated. So even though it looks like you're making more money, right, than your parents were, in reality you don't really have the same amount of buying power. Your buying power hasn't gone up that much. And the people who are doing well in the modern economy tend to be kind of like that top 10%, especially since the 1980s. So that's some economic trends. Last kind of like sort of economic key type thing has to do with the debate over energy and over fossil fuels, sort of economic consumption and debates in the economy. This is of course fueled by the ongoing conflicts with the United States in the Middle East, and it really escalates after 9/11. But even before that, we're starting to sort of come to terms with things like climate change in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The first attempt at the United States at sort of like dealing with this in a policy way is that we are part of and originally joined something called the Kyoto Protocol, which was supposed to be an agreement between a bunch of nations to reduce like greenhouse gas emissions to try to deal with the problem of global warming. And the United States initially signs it under Clinton and then withdraws from it under the second Bush administration, so George W. Bush, Bush the son, in 2001. Sort of a similar vibe in 2015 under the Obama administration. The United States is like a pilot of what's called the Paris Climate Agreement, where a bunch of countries, again, are committing to reduce greenhouse gases and a variety of other climate pledges, and then we withdraw from that after Trump is elected in 2016. So there's this sort of continual push and pull over, what kinds of policy should we have around like environmental regulations. Next kind of topic for historical period 9, and this is a common one that we've seen in a bunch of other periods as well, is this question of migration inside of the United States and then immigration, right, from outside of the United States. I already talked just a little bit about immigration policy, so we're going to look just a little bit more at trends here. Again, since 1965, we have seen sort of demographic trends and demographic shifts in the United States. A big one is that we have seen the population of the United States moving from the Rust Belt, which is sort of the area around the Great Lakes, right, where we were strong in the Gilded Age and industrial era, places like Detroit, Cincinnati, Cleveland, right, Pittsburgh, etc. And then moving down into what we usually call the Sun Belt, right, California, Texas, Florida, right, the places like Georgia, Arizona as well. And you can see here from 1940 to 1980 to 2010, generally the population density of the United States increasing, like overall, like our population has grown, and also the shifting of that population, especially I think notable if you take a look at what's going on out in the West Coast from 1940 to 1980 and then to 2010, right, the population density there increases quite a bit. Of course, remember that when population moves, it moves political power with it, right? So we're going to see increasing political power moving into these states. States like Florida and Texas and California, right, have become increasingly important in national politics, right, as the populations increase and they get more power in the electoral college, right, those kinds of things. Another obviously really big kind of immigration shift is what I was talking about a little bit on the previous slide. Since 1965, right, we have seen shifts in immigration, and particularly what you need to know about this kind of third wave of immigration is that increasingly people who are coming to the US are coming from Latin America and from sort of Asia more broadly. Previously, when we've talked about Asian immigration to the US, it's really been centered on China, but from 1965 onward, it includes like the rest of Asia as well, right, Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, right, etc. You can see, again, immigration flows by country down here. So we've talked about sort of three waves in this class. Here's sort of the first one in blue, right, Ireland and Germany. Here's kind of that middle one, the second one, the new immigrants, right, in green, Italy and Russia, right? And then here we are in the third one, big spike over here, right, Mexico is the kind of particularly highlighted country, and then that's China in pink there as well. So impacts on the economy, of course, are that they are supplying the economy with a very important labor force and bringing lots of skills, and impacts on culture. Number one, obviously diversifying American culture and enriching it in many significant ways. And also, as every wave of historical immigration has, leading to a significant nativist backlash, right, anti-immigrant or xenophobic backlash that you should understand and recognize as being very similar, sort of reflecting the same types of tropes that we've seen in previous waves of immigration. Last of these kind of like demographic shifts to be aware of, as the baby boom kind of generation is aging, right, as they're sort of moving up through the population, the age of the average American has also been increasing over the last, 20 or 30 years in particular. Sociologists sometimes call this the graying of America, like we're getting older as a population, right, we're sort of aging. And of course, this has consequences as well. It puts strains on our healthcare system and on programs like Social Security, right, Medicare and Medicaid that are intended to help people in this sort of aging population as well. So those are important things to kind of keep aware of. Last topic for historical period 9 that we're going to talk about is the sort of causes and effects of what they're sort of generally calling like domestic and international challenges in the 21st century, but what really centers around basically 9/11 and the aftermath. This is really the last most recent topics that you should be seeing on the test. It is very likely that you will get a multiple choice question that at least references the wars on terror. So just as some reminders, right, on September 11th, 2001, the organization Al-Qaeda, which is based in Afghanistan, launches terrorist attacks on the United States. They target the World Trade Center in New York, which is a symbol of the American economy. They target the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which is a symbol of the American military, and they most likely were targeting either the White House or the U.S. Capitol building as a symbol of the American government. So government, military, and economy as a essentially form of protest against what they saw as American economic, governmental, and military dominance or interference right in the Middle East. What 9/11, of course, leads to or launches the United States into is a whole new era of foreign policy, to me very similar to what we talked about with the Cold War, how it kind of reshapes or restructures American foreign policy in a significant way. On the domestic side, domestic impacts that the College Board would like you to know a little bit about, the fact that the war on terror really brought about a bunch of impacts on the United States where we were trying to improve security, make ourselves more safe or prevent future terrorist attacks. And in order to do that, the sort of sacrifice, the kind of thing that we wind up giving up or sort of weighing in balance are protections of civil liberties and human rights. Very similar to stuff that we've talked about in previous videos, Lincoln suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War, restriction of freedom of speech during World War I with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, restricting the civil liberties of Japanese Americans with Japanese internment during World War II, right? This stuff sort of falls into the same boat of this debate between security and civil liberties. Most famous is the passage of the USA Patriot Act, which is a big long acronym. You don't need to know what it stands for, but these are basically a series of laws and provisions that are intended to make it easier for various law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement, to sort of like hunt out and find like, secret terrorist activity inside of the United States. So, for example, it allows the federal government to like wiretap your phone without really having to go through the same like warrant, like get a warrant, procedures that they would have to do if they say that they have reason to suspect that you are a terrorist. They can look through your mail. They can ask your local library to tell them what books you've been checking out, right? All sorts of things that, again, would be considered invasive or unconstitutional if you were just suspected of, like, murdering someone. But if you're suspected of terrorism, then, like, it's much easier for them to surveil you, basically. A lot of the parts of the Patriot Act have been struck down or challenged. Lots of them also still remain in place or in force. Other kind of post 9/11 stuff along this line, we create a brand new cabinet department, the Department of Homeland Security, to try to kind of coordinate like our civil defense responses to terrorism. This is when airport security, federal airport security, is created. The TSA, or Transportation Security Administration, basically exists because of 9/11. It used to be handled much more to like an airport by airport level. On sort of each airport would have their own kind of like security. This is like the federal government has like a security force, right? That's making you take your shoes off before you get on an airplane. We've had Guantanamo Bay like as a military base since the Spanish-American War. It's one of the sort of things that we get from Cuba in the wake of the Spanish-American War. But this is when we open it as like essentially a black site prison, right? The Guantanamo Bay detention camp opens in January of 2002. Another really big debate that comes out of this is the question about drone strikes and the extent to which the United States military should be using drone strikes, which allow you're not engaged in combat like face to face. You're sort of sitting in a room somewhere far away, like hitting a button, right, and firing a drone. So again, that's another sort of big debate that comes out of this. Most directly, though, of course, what 9/11 leads the United States into is you could look at this as like two wars, or they're also sort of both part of a broader, what we might call war on terror. We have a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq. The war in Afghanistan starts immediately after 9/11. We believe, probably correctly, that the Taliban government of Afghanistan is very aware that Al-Qaeda is based in Afghanistan and is essentially sheltering them. So we go into Afghanistan with the goal of knocking out the Taliban government and then sort of finding and dismantling Al-Qaeda. The war in Iraq starts a couple of years later and is really unrelated to 9/11, except that it's sort of also in the Middle East, and we kind of also broadly connect it to American security from potential future attacks. Specifically, the Bush government argues that the government of Iraq, still headed by Saddam Hussein, has developed WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, and that we have proof of that. And so we're going to go in and we're going to knock out this government that is developing nuclear weapons and could be a threat to the United States. In both of these two wars, the initial war goes very well and quickly. It's like a brief conventional war. We sort of roll in. We've got tanks, right? We've got drones. We're flying planes. We're dropping bombs. And within 6 weeks of entering Afghanistan, the Taliban government has been toppled. And within about a month or 6 weeks of entering Iraq, the Hussein government has been toppled. Saddam Hussein flees and is eventually captured and killed. So initially, right, very kind of conventional wars with successes. But then in both of these countries, what these turn into is much more long, drawn-out invasions. Right, as we try to sort of rebuild the country and create a government that we can kind of prop up that will be like friendly to the United States. It looks very, very similar to what we talked about in Vietnam, with these kind of continued insurgencies that are very, very difficult to fight, these wars that become very drawn out and costly and sort of are going on for quite a long time. You can see the dates there on the slides. Also a lot of conflict, because when we do get into Iraq, we do not find weapons of mass destruction, so there's quite a lot of debate there, similar to what we talked about in Vietnam about like was the American public misled? Were we lied to, right, about why we got into Iraq itself? Broader than just these two specific wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, what we might call sort of like the war on terror, swings us back to something that we talked about in the last video, and this is sort of the debate over the extent to which the executive branch should have power. Like, how much power should the executive branch have in like foreign policy and diplomacy? And a lot of this centers around something called the AUMF, the Authorization for Use of Military Force. A few days after September 11th, 2001, so September 14th, 2001, Congress passes something called the AUMF, which is essentially like an authorization for use of military force by the president. Supposed to basically be against the sort of Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but successive American presidents since 2001, so that was George W. Bush, and then after him Obama, and then after him Biden and Trump, right, and these other presidents that we've had since, have really interpreted this quite broadly to just kind of broadly give the United States president power to deploy troops or military resources or engage in fighting terrorism, kind of like all over the world, right, in any sort of form or fashion. So the AUMF, which was authorized in 2001, is, as of the recording of this video anyway, is still authorized and is still used as essentially like the justification for most of the United States' kind of like anti-terrorism activity around the world. And so it's a great kind of connection, right, to the discussion that we had earlier about the War Powers Act that was passed after the Vietnam War, and the concerns about the uses of executive power. So, on that note, this is the end of Historical Period 9 and the end of your content review for the AP US History exam. If you've been hanging out for all of these videos, I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you, and good luck on the test. Bye, y'all.